In this segment, we'll look at arguments in favor of civil disobedience, as well as reasons to think that one ought to accept her punishment and reasons to think one ought not accept her punishment, or at least needn't accept her punishment when one engages in civil disobedience. So, in order to support the claim that some instances of civil disobedience have been just, and that some future instances are likely to be just, Zinn notes that civil disobedience has accomplished many good things where other means might have failed. He doesn't really say much about this, but here's some of the kinds of things he has in mind. The civil rights movement, he thinks, would not have achieved its goals, at least not as quickly, if not for civil disobedience. And you would need to study the history to decide whether or not you agree with Zinn on this. Similarly, having a minimum wage, he thinks, would not have been accomplished if not for civil disobedience. Having a 40-hour work week, he thinks, would not have been accomplished if not for civil disobedience. Having Social Security, he thinks, would not have been accomplished if not for civil disobedience. Now, in each of these cases, you might say, well, I think those things ought not have been accomplished. I think the civil rights movement, a minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, and Social Security are bad things. Or you might say, I think they're good things, but they would have been accomplished without civil disobedience. Zinn here isn't providing an argument. Instead, he's providing an invitation to look into the history of these things and see what you think. The Declaration of Independence, he thinks, would not have been accomplished without civil disobedience. Again, you can say, I don't think the Declaration of Independence was a good thing. I think it would have been better if North America had stayed under British rule. Or you might say, I think it was a good thing, but I think it would have been accomplished without any civil disobedience. Again, Zinn disagrees, and he's inviting you to look at the history. Notice, this is relevant to what I just said, that these cases support his claim only if the relevant result came, at least in part, from civil disobedience, and the relevant result increases justice. A full defense of those claims of civil disobedience would require defending those claims, which would require a careful study of the relevant histories. And I invite you to look into the relevant history and see what you think. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about accepting punishment. So why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because there's a very common view that goes like this. It's okay to engage in civil disobedience, but you have to accept your punishment. What that means is if you refuse to accept your punishment, you're undermining the legitimacy of your civil disobedience. Put another way, if your civil disobedience is just, then you accept your punishment. Zinn disagrees. And I should say, this is a very common view. You hear this all the time. So when Edward Snowden first leaked the information about the NSA's spying programs, there were very many people who said, well, I think the spying programs were wrong. I think it's good that we know about them. But it was wrong for Snowden to do it. Why? Because he didn't accept his punishment. It would only be morally acceptable for him to leak these documents if he chose to accept his punishment. Zinn disagrees. He says, well, maybe I should also mention this. There was a humorous, well, I don't know, depends what you think is humorous, but I thought was humorous at the time, idea that went around that said this, that Snowden's leaking the documents was unjust because he didn't accept his punishment, while Daniel Ellsberg leaking the Pentagon Papers, which I mentioned in the brief introduction to Zinn and King's life, Ellsberg's leaking the Pentagon Papers was just because he did accept his punishment. And in fact, Ellsberg didn't really accept his punishment. He hid out and only chose to go to trial when it was clear public opinion was in his favor. And Ellsberg himself came out very strongly saying he thought Snowden ought not accept his punishment because he thought his punishment would be wildly disproportionate to the crime. At any rate, this view is very common that if you engage in civil disobedience, you undermine it unless you accept your punishment. And here's what Zinn says in reply. He says, why agree to be punished when you think you have acted rightly and that the law, punishing you for that, has acted wrongly? Why is it all right to disobey the law in the first instance, but then when you are sentenced to prison, start obeying it? So here's his idea. Remember, we're not talking about a view on which civil disobedience is always unjust. Nor are we talking about a particular act of civil disobedience that you take to be unjust. When we're talking about accepting your punishment, we're just stipulating that some civil disobedience is just and that the particular act under consideration would be just if you accepted your punishment, but wouldn't be just if you didn't. And what Zinn's saying is, look, if you agree that the initial act of civil disobedience is just, why do you think it's unjust to avoid punishment for it? Because isn't the punishment inappropriate if the initial act was just? The idea behind accept your punishment, he says, it's often advanced, he says, by liberals who are sympathetic with dissent. So the idea behind accept your punishment is this, that whatever your disagreement with some specific law or specific or particular policy may be, you should not spread disrespect for the law in general, because we need respect for the law to keep society intact. Now notice again, this is a very Hobbesian idea. And now I'll continue with the quote. This is like saying because apples are good for children, we must insist that they not refuse rotten ones, because that might lead them to reject all apples. Well, says Zinn, good apples are good for your health and rotten apples are bad. Bad laws and bad policies endanger our lives and freedoms. Why can't we trust human intelligence to make the proper distinctions among laws as we do among apples? Okay. We'll close with a quote from Vladimir Putin. This was not this year, but a few years ago when I was teaching this subject. This just happened to be in the New York Times that day, so I just added it to the slide. He says, quote, "We need to use the United Nations Security Council and believe that preserving law and order in today's complex and turbulent world is one of the few ways to keep international relations from sliding into chaos. The law is still the law, and we must follow it whether we like it or not." So Putin is expressing a very Hobbesian view. He's sort of expressing the chaos argument that we went over a few segments ago. Okay, and we'll stop there.